Right.
Welcome to today's virtual standards meeting. Before we start the formal business of the meeting, I must remind you that the audio of this meeting is being broadcast live on the Council's website, and the video of the meeting will be published afterwards. I would like to introduce, first of all, the officers supporting today's meeting. The councillors in attendance will be introduced shortly. We have Helen Barrington, Director of Organisational Development and Democratic Services, and we have myself, Caroline McCleary, Democratic Services Officer, and Claire Burrows, Democratic Services Officer. Thank you, Chair. We can now formally begin the meeting.
Thank you, and welcome to this August meeting of the Standards Committee. In attendance, we have Councillors Elwood, Clive Towsey-Hinton, Councillor Michael Payne, who's also the Vice Chair of this committee, Councillor Martin Smith, Councillor Mike Hope and Councillor Pat Bosworth. And in attendance, we have John Bagley, the independent person, also attending. So welcome to this. Last time we met formally as a committee, it was in person just before lockdown. It's probably the last thing that we did before lockdown as councillors. So welcome to this format of doing things. Should you have any questions or need to speak, then please raise your hand if you can, and there is also a button to actually raise your hand. If you hover on your mouse, there is a thing to do that, and I will try and keep a little eye on that if I possibly can, and bring you in as appropriate as I would in a normal committee. But if I don't see you, then keep doing it, because I will get round to you. Formally on item 1, then we have some apologies, I believe, that we need to take, and I'm not aware of any substitutions.
Thank you, Councillor Boyle. We have received apologies from Councillor Simon Murray. We have also received apologies from the Reserve Independent person Susan Dewey, and also Patricia Woodfield. Thank you.
Fine.
Chair,
Okay.
can I also sorry to interrupt, can I also come in on that point? Rosalie Hawkes should be joining us later, so if she doesn't attend, we will formally mark her apologies down, but she is hoping to join the meeting in a short while, Chair.
Of course, yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so item 2 then is to approve as a correct record the minutes of a meeting on the 12th of March. That's the one just before lockdown that I was referring to. I think I've got a minor amendment in that Councillor Clive Towsey-Hinton was actually in attendance at that meeting, and with that proviso of that amendment to the minutes, then do I have a proposer and a seconder to approve as a correct record, unless people have any other corrections to make on accuracy, first of all.
Yeah, I'll propose that they're to record, yeah.
Thank you.
With that amendment, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, with that amendment, yeah. Fine. Can I have a show of hands for accepting the minutes as approved? That is approved. Thank you. So moving on from that, then item 3, declarations of interest that affects any other item that we have on the agenda, and I believe Michael Payne has one to make.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Just to declare that in relation to item 4 on the agenda today, which is the LGA consultation on the Model Code of Conduct, there is reference in the report made to the LGA Executive and the LGA Executive Advisory Board, which have considered the Model Code of Conduct, both of which I am a member of. So I am a member of the LGA Executive and the LGA Executive Advisory Board. The report is only to note, Chair, but I am simply making the declaration for transparency purposes.
Thank you, Councillor Payne. That's very helpful, and I'm sure, you know, in our tradition as being as open as possible, that's much appreciated. Thank you. Any other declarations of interest? No. Okay, so that's fine. Thank you very much. So we are now on said item 4 of the LGA consultation on the model code of conduct. There was an online working party that met on the I think it was the 12th of August, which went through a lot of these things, and I know Helen's going to formally take us through that. But before we do, I want to express my thanks for the diligence, work and contributions in detail that people made there. I know it's quite a tiring business to do, so I want to formally thank everybody who attended that meeting because it was a good job of work, well done in my view. Helen.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I probably don't need to say too much more than you've already said in introducing the report. Members will be aware of the background in relation to the LGA Model Code of Conduct and the fact that that came from some recommendations made by the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Unfortunately, that original consultation period was delayed due to COVID. And as you say, quite rightly, we carried out a very in-depth discussion on the LGA Model Code at a working group comprising a number of members of this committee on the 12th of August. I would also like to express my thanks to members. I thought it was an excellent discussion on the code, and the input from members was obviously translated into a formal consultation response, which was submitted on the following Monday, the 17th of August. Unfortunately, I had to produce this report before that consultation response went into the LGA, so I wasn't able to append it to this report, but it has been sent to all members of the committee. So obviously a number of you contributed, but I thought it would be very, very useful just to bring this report for completeness to committee. And obviously, if any members of the committee who weren't present at the working group have any questions about that consultation report, then obviously I'm happy to respond to those questions, but I'm sure other members of the group would also be willing to respond. So in terms of the report, Chair, it's just here to note.
Thank you, and thanks for that introduction. As I said, yeah, as Helen said, yeah, we worked through all the points and made a submission, which Helen had to draft afterwards, but it wasn't ready for the paperwork for this meeting. I mean, from I think a general consensus was that the actual consultation was perhaps on a draft that could have been better, although we were in support of the general aims of it. I think it's probably a reasonable summary of it. So what I'll do now is, if people have got specific questions or contributions to make, I'll go around the room, as it were, and take those. I think Michael Payne has got his hand up at the moment.
Apologies, Chair. That's still showing from earlier on the declarations of interest. Nothing further to add at this stage, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else wishing to either ask questions or comment on that piece of work that was done between meetings? Yes, John.
Well, I'd just like to thank Helen for making such a wonderfully comprehensive summary, if I could call it a summary, of all the conversation that went on at the working party meeting. The other thing that I'd like to say is, at that meeting, Helen did reply to my question about the necessity of adopting an LGA model code, and was told that we had no choice. Now, I have to admit that I don't update myself routinely with all the stuff that comes out from all these great and noble bodies, but my reading of the original report from the Committee on Standards in Public Life, page 11, quite clearly says, well, on the bottom of the right-hand side of page 10, codes of conduct, it says there are a lot of, or they've all been adopted, and there are a lot of very good ones, but there were particular adverse comments about many of the codes not including enough on social media and on bullying and harassment. It goes on then to say there are, however, benefits to local authorities being able to amend and have ownership of their own codes of conduct. The updated model code should therefore be voluntary and be able to be adapted and adopted by local authorities. The scope of the code of conduct should also be widened, and we'll come on to that later, with a rebuttable presumption that a councillor's public behaviour, including comments made on publicly accessible social media, is in their official capacity. And also in the best practice document, best practice 3, principled authorities should review their own, it just says should review their code of conduct each year and regularly seek, where possible, the views of the public, community organisations and neighbouring authorities. Has something been issued since those documents that says there is no choice but to accept the LGA document? Sorry, I finished there.
Thank you, Chair. If I might respond to that. So, yes, you're absolutely right in relation to the recommendations that were in the Committee on Standards in Public Life report. Obviously, those were the recommendations that started this process. In answer to the question at the working group, it was my understanding that the expectation would be that councils would adopt the model code of conduct. Of course, that would only be a legal requirement if the legislation was amended to require us to do so. I've not seen anything concrete to suggest that is absolutely going to be what will happen, but my understanding as monitoring officer from discussions in my sort of professional field is the expectation would be that we would adopt the model code as a basis for our code. If we wish to add provision to it to reflect local circumstances, then there is the discretion to enable us to do that. But as I say, my understanding is that we would be expected to adopt the model code, but obviously it needs to go through the process. It needs to come out of the other end of the LGA process and be approved by the board, and then we need to see whether government actually changes the legislation to make it a requirement. If that helps explain my understanding of what might happen.
I think it does. If I may, I'll give you a chance in a minute, John, but I've got a couple of sort of specific questions on this. Assuming then that the LGA process does conclude at some point later this year, then there is the question of our processes in which we tend to look at our own code of conduct and amend as necessary given the experiences of the previous year. Now that is likely to overlap in this process, it seems to me. So we may need to revise what we do in relation to that, because there's absolutely no point in revising our own code if we then adopt another one and then wanting to give it a while before revising it again. So we may need to look at the timetable of such things. So that, but yeah, I'll go to John, because I'm sure he wanted to come back on what Helen has said, and perhaps after that, if you could comment on what I've just intimated there, Helen.
Thank you. I'd just say that I would still prefer, if we had any room for manoeuvre, to just update our own code and take in, because Helen has made our code much more, well, her response includes a lot of detail in there, which could be added in one way or another to our own code and make it better than it is now, and more comprehensive than it is now. But as you know, that my where I'm basically coming from is that I would not want to adopt it, but I have no vote in this, but I would not wish you to adopt an LGA code.
Fine, no, I understand that, because you think ours is so much better. I understand.
Yep.
That. Yeah, Helen, I don't know if you want to respond to both of those at the same time.
Thank you, Chair, if I may. So in terms of the code that we currently have in place, obviously that's a document that I've substantially drafted, but it was based on consultation with Standards Committee when the Localism Act came into force originally. And as you know, we've reviewed it since then through another working group. I do think it's a robust document. I do think there's an advantage in a model code from a consistency perspective, and certainly as a monitoring officer working with parish council codes and our own code, and sometimes the difficulty that presents. I think this is why the Committee on Standards in Public Life and the LGA is now progressing this as a recommendation. You know, there is an absolute benefit in having some consistency nationally, and an expectation that all elected members, whether you're an elected member to a county council, to a district council, to a parish council, there's a certain level of behaviours that you are expected to keep. So I think we need to I guess watch this space in terms of what happens through the LGA, what sort of code comes out of the other end. In terms of practicalities, Chair, absolutely you're spot on in relation to the other recommendation from CSPL around regular review of our own code. I certainly wouldn't want to create an awful lot of work for myself or the committee in reviewing code when we know that there's a potential for a model code coming later on down the line. If there is a change to the legislation that requires us to adopt the model code, but gives us the flexibility to add things in if we feel that that's appropriate due to local circumstances, then I would be bringing that back into the Standards Committee and taking the same approach that we've done before. So potentially, again, having a little working group that would look at it in detail, bring it back through Standards Committee, and then up to full council to approve. So I think there is that process that we would follow in order to get to the point where we had an approved code.
So we may have to actually look at our own scheduled meetings, as I don't think we have another meeting scheduled this year. So we may have to look at that in particular in relation to these things.
Timing, yes.
Normally we'd meet quarterly and we'd meet maybe around about November again. So, but there isn't timetabled at the moment, and we may need to actually address that point. Mike Hope, I'm going to take first, and then Michael Payne afterwards.
Yeah, can I just say, I was on this working group, and the impression I got was that we all felt that in lots of ways what was being suggested was right, but didn't go far enough and wasn't explicit enough. And I feel that the obvious thing to do is, if it's possible, is to take on board whatever code comes out of the LGA, and then add to it. We certainly, from my viewing of what was discussed, we certainly won't be taking away. We will simply be adding to it and making clearer the implications of the code. So, you know, that's something that we don't do until we know what's being offered.
Councillor Payne.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Just to say that I'd concur broadly with the comments made by John Bagley. I mean, from somebody who's been, you know, up close in the conversations about how this model code of conduct, member code of conduct, has been developed, I think the whole intention is for it to be a minimum standard. And I'd concur with John's point. I think we, as Helen says, wait to see what the Committee on Standards in Public Life say, wait to see whether there are going to be any changes in legislation that compel us to adopt the model code, but that's not where we are at the moment. It was drafted as a intended template that could be either adopted in whole or in part, is the language that was used by both the LGA and the Committee on Standards in Public Life. But nonetheless, whether there's a legislative change or not, I think we should see this as a minimum standard, but we should absolutely, as Councillor Hope has just said, bolster that minimum standard with the robust provisions that we've already got in place in our own code. So I'd concur with the approach that John's setting out. I just think we need to see what the process churns out in terms of legislative change. But wherever we end up, whether we're compelled or not, I think John's right. This has to be seen as a minimum standard, and we don't adopt a minimum standard and at the same time ditch some of the robust provisions that are in place that we already have. I think, frankly, what this was trying to achieve, Chair, if I may, was tackling issues around the country where actually some councils have got very weak or watered down, or codes of conduct that haven't actually been reviewed or given due attention to. I think there was a brief period, Helen will be aware of this in her professional experience, where some standards committees were subsumed into audit and wider committees, and actually the work of standards got lost in that agenda, whereas we took a conscious decision here in Gedling to retain a separate standards committee, which I think we've been vindicated on. I think was the right decision. It allows focus on the issues rather than it being lost in the wider issues around audit, etc. So I'd support the proposal that John Bagley's setting out in terms of, let's not throw out some of the really good stuff we've got in our code of conduct that actually, as Councillor Hope says, probably goes further than the model code that the LGA's come up with.
Yeah, I'm certainly in agreement with that, and would see that we progress in that way if we possibly can. But we'll have to wait and see what the legislative changes, if any, are. Helen.
Thank you, Chair. If I just might respond, I guess in terms of the contents of the other code, just to I guess make the point that it was a draft code, and the whole reason for going out to consultation is obviously the LGA will have consulted in a very informal way with some stakeholders to produce the document that we saw. But the reason for going out for that wider consultation, and you'll see in the report that we obviously contributed to that online consultation. The LGA were also running a number of workshops which I participated in, and that really was an opportunity for the LGA to hear from, experienced monitoring officers. The reason for asking for online responses is to hear from, standards committees, co-opted members, independent persons, to really get that wider understanding of what's needed moving forward. So I would envisage that the code that ultimately comes out the other end will look very different to the document that we saw, and that's the benefit of consultation. As I say, that's the whole reason why the LGA would have taken that wider views from stakeholders. So I think, as I say, we need to watch this space. I agree with John. I absolutely feel that we've got a very good, robust standards regime in place at Gedling, which is underpinned by a very robust code of conduct. And as a monitoring officer, I wouldn't want to see that watered down, but we do need to see what the legislation brings for us. And obviously, if there is a legislative change, I would absolutely be bringing further reports back into this committee.
Thank you, Helen, and that sort of sets out what the position is. Any other comments, particularly from those who may not have spoken yet? Any others? Otherwise, I need a proposer. Oh, John.
If I could just make a cheeky comment, the sort of timetable I think you're looking at is that we won't have anything firm for about a year or getting on for a year. So one could perhaps open a book on whether the COVID vaccination arrives first or an official new code of practice. That's my viewpoint.
Well, we shall see if you're right. And if you're right, maybe when lockdown is over, I'll buy you a pint on the basis of it. Okay, I need a formal proposer to note the report.
I'm happy to propose that we note the report, Chair.
I'll second.
Fine, proposed and seconded. Perhaps we could take away the possible need for an extra meeting should the timetable change, Helen, and make sure we make provision for that and what we need to do next. So that's item 4. Good discussion as always on these things, and thanks again to Helen and the working group for the work they've done on this, and to the LGA to actually put out a consultation as well. So I'm moving on now to item 5, which is a report on gifts and hospitality, which comes every year to us on those as it's required to. Helen will be introducing that too. And it's on page 39 of your pack, if you're referring to your pack.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I will assume members have read the report, but just if I may pick out a few points for you. So those of you who've been members of the Standards Committee for some time will be familiar with the Gifts and Hospitality annual report that comes in. And you'll know that we've made a number of changes and improvements to the way in which we register gifts and hospitality over a period of time. You might remember the last time I reported that we'd had an audit, so our internal auditors had carried out a review of gifts and hospitality. We had substantial assurance in that audit, but they they'd made a couple of recommendations that they felt would improve the process, which we did implement. Last year, so during 2019, we also decided to transfer the Gibson Hospitality Register for Employees onto an online system that we already have in place. So it's called the Employee Claim System, and it's a system that we use for employees to make digital application for leave, for example, or to request that we pay mileage or expenses. And we were able to produce a bolt-on for Gibson Hospitality, which has absolutely improved the efficiency in the process, and in particular for me, provided me with the ability to run reports, lifetime reports off the system, so that I can see on a quarterly basis what is going on around Gibson Hospitality that's actually been logged on the system, but also whether it's been approved by the service manager. That system also automatically sends an email reminder to service managers at the end of each quarter, so that obviates the need for me to personally send those emails out to service managers. It's done automatically. Also, during 2019, I've provided a number of presentations. I've delivered a number of presentations to SLT and service managers about Gibson Hospitality. So this is not a new thing. It's been around for many, many years, and sometimes it is forgotten about. So it's just making sure that this is on everybody's radar. So a couple of presentations that were referred to in the report at paragraph 1.2. In terms of members, I can't include members in that online system because it's a particular system for employees. So we still continue to hold an electronic register for members within the iDrive, and obviously members will receive through the councillor contacts regular email every quarter. You will receive a reminder to keep your register interests up to date, but also to make sure that if you've received any gifts and hospitality over £50, then you let me know. Obviously, you'll appreciate the Democratic Services support that particular register for me. You'll also recall from the reports that I've brought in, so the update reports on the Committee on Standards in Public Life recommendations, there was a recommendation that we are more open and transparent about Gibson Hospitality that are received by members, and that we should be publishing that register on a quarterly basis in a CSV file format. And you'll recall from those previous reports that I have been doing that, and that best practice recommendation has been ticked off. So in terms of looking at the register itself, the entries on the registers for officers show that during 2019-20 across the council officers, 92 offers of gifts or hospitality were made, 89 were accepted and 3 were refused. The information is detailed in the appendix to the report, but you'll see that most common gifts are things like boxes of chocolates, biscuits, etc. Very, very low level gifts, and generally they are shared out among teams. In terms of hospitality, there were 19 instances of hospitality consisting of networking, lunches and dinners at conferences and awards ceremony. In relation to Office of Hospitality and gifts recorded by members, again, they're set out in Appendix 2. You'll see in the report that I've made a comment about the fact that actually the level and the value of those Office of Hospitality fall below that 50%, but the members decided in the spirit of openness and transparency to report those into me, so they do appear on the register. So in reviewing the register entries, what you will see from the report, because I provided you with some comparative figures, is that there are significantly more entries in 2019-20 than the previous years. And I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I actually feel that the additional promotion and the presentations to officers around gifts and hospitality has actually meant that more people understand when they need to register them. So I will keep a watching brief on those, and obviously if it continues to climb, then I might raise concerns about that, but at the moment I don't have any concerns. I also don't have any concerns about the hospitality that have been registered by members. So paragraph 1.6 just flags up a couple of practical issues, and we do find this quite frequently when we introduced digital platforms, online systems, that actually you create a system, you think it's going to work, and actually when data comes out the other side you realise that there are some improvements that need to be made. So there are a couple of things that I flag up there, and again just to give some assurance to members of the Standards Committee that the issues have been identified and we've actually rectified those issues through the system, so I do not expect those to be seen next year. So again, this report is just for noting, but obviously if any members of the Standards Committee have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Fine, thanks, Helen. That's a good explanation, I think, of where we are. We are doing what we said we were going to do in terms of transparency, both in terms of elected members and in terms of staff, and I think that's great. It may be that we note and there are no concerns, but the fact that it's brought forward and we have that mechanism, I think is incredibly useful. So I'll take direct questions about either list at the moment. So Martin Smith, I see you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Helen intimated there's been an increase in the amount of hospitality that's been received. I take it that it's actually been given as a reward for some of the excellent work that the frontline staff are actually doing. Whilst we don't actually list the reasons why the gifts were given, I'm sure the vast majority were thank you gifts for great work. So again, that is certainly a positive.
Thank you, Chair. If I might respond to that. So in relation to gifts, what you do tend to find is that gifts tend to be offered to staff around Christmas time. So as I say, it's not unusual for a customer perhaps to come in with a box of chocolates or a box of biscuits to thank staff for the good work over the year. What our code of practice says is that we should only accept gifts that are of low value. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but there are criminal offences for public officials accepting any gifts or hospitality. So there are offences under the Local Government Act and offences under the Bribery Act. We have a code of practice in place that seeks to enable low value gifts that are to thank public officials for the good work, but also to make sure that officers are not accepting goods of a significant value. So if, for example, an offer of a bottle of whiskey was made, that would be politely declined. If the offerer was insistent that the member of staff accepted that, the member of staff would reluctantly accept it, but would then donate that bottle of whiskey to the Mayor's charity. And again, I haven't produced all of the information that I can actually pull off the system, but there is an ability for comments to be added into the system so that I can see where I'm looking at a particular gift that's been offered and I think I'm not quite sure that that is low value. I can see where that has gone. So expensive bottles of wine or expensive bottles of whiskey, where they can't be given back to the person that's offered them, they will go into the Mayor's charity and they will be raffled and the benefit will go to the charity. We have had instances, and again you can see in the report, where quite large hampers have been offered, so significant value, we're talking hundreds of pounds to officers. They are absolutely declined and they are returned to sender. In relation to hospitality, it generally isn't in recognition of good work or a reward for officers. What you tend to find that is these are associated with award ceremonies or potentially involvement in particular organisations. So officers will perhaps be a member of APSI or a member of the LGA, and actually as part of that role they will go and attend quite properly an event, a function or a conference, and as part of that they will have their dinner paid for them. So again, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that in terms of bribery and corruption, but again from an openness and transparency perspective we want to make sure that that is registered on the Gifts and Hospitality Register so that we're able to obviously monitor that, and as Councillor Boyle explained, there's openness and transparency, so it's reported into SLT and it's also reported into yourself as Standards Committee. So I hope I've answered that question, Councillor Smith, and given you some explanation as to the circumstances in which gifts and hospitality might be offered.
Councillor Smith, is that answer what the points that you were raising there?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, I've got one or two, if I may, before we move on. One is in relation to what Helen quite rightly said, as sort of a summarised list that we see in our report there. I wonder, it's only just a floating suggestion as I'm thinking about it, whether another column for the reason, which I think is submitted into the long report that you actually have, could be reproduced in here in future, so that make it a little bit clearer as to where these things have come from. So that's my first question or point, if you like. And the other one is that on the bottom of page 43 on that list there, we've got community relations, and we have wine left over from event 9584 accepted. I'm not sure what that is. That something that we put on and then the wine went back and was used elsewhere, or what was that? Because it seems a slightly larger amount than some of these other things.
So thank you, Chair. If I may just respond to those questions. So in relation to the first question, absolutely, if members would find it helpful to have the reasons column as part of this report when I bring it next year, I can absolutely do that. When I run the report, there are probably about 20 columns on it, because actually what I want to see is the progress. So it might help you understand practically what happens. So a member of staff who's offered gift or hospitality enters it on the system, so they fill a certain amount of information in, and then it goes up the chain to their line manager for their line manager to say whether it was acceptable for that gift to be accepted or refused, and that creates an awful lot of columns. So when I produce this particular report, I try to slim it down to really focus on the information that Standards Committee would find helpful, but I can certainly add that in next year. In relation to that particular one, I don't have the detailed information with me. I can certainly email you after the committee if you want me to give you an assurance on that one. What I would say is that if the member of staff took that wine home with them at that value, I would have raised a concern. So my suggestion is that it was donated to the Mayor's charity, or it was used for another council event. It wasn't something that went into a member of staff's private home, but obviously I can check the full register behind the scenes, and I can email all members of Standards Committee if you'd like me to do that.
Yeah, just to go, I'm sure it's fine, but just the figures just jumped out at me, which is why I asked the question more than anything else. But yes, and thank you for in relation to adding that extra column. I think that for me at least that would be helpful to drive these discussions. Any other points or questions from anyone else on this one? John, I think.
Sort of circumstances that Helen was outlining a little earlier. Things like project celebrations would come under that as well, would they? Because you might have, well, I remember the Loop Road, but of course that was county council stuff. But on the Loop, when the Loop Road was built, there was a sort of a celebration when the first sod was dug, and another great big celebration when it all ended. If I remember rightly, essentially it was the food was buffet. But there were huge quantities of glug going down, and you just wonder whether at least being present at such an occasion might be something that would come under this.
Yes, Chair, if I might respond to that. So absolutely, if hospitality is being accepted at that type of event by an officer, we would expect to see that on the gifts and hospitality register. So yes, if it was in the situation that you describe, it would have been entered. Yeah.
Thank you.
And one would hope it didn't drive any of the diggers afterwards. But,
well, just if I may interject at that point, Chair, if a member of staff is actually on duty, we have a no alcohol policy. So a member of staff would not be entitled to accept and drink alcohol while they are working.
Well, it was a long time ago.
Yes.
Okay, any other points or questions on this section before I move on? No. All right, I need a formal proposed and seconder to note that. Oh, sorry, Councillor Elwood, I've got you raising your hand there.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, it really just some clarification. I'm assuming that on the list for the officers accepting hospitality would sort of like the planning department, would that come under development services? That's always a contentious issue with accepting gifts, but I can't really see many at all for development services. But
yes, thank you. If I may, absolutely, planning would come under development services. So I think there are a couple of entries on the register. In fact, the first one I think is a really useful one to flag up. So that was a John Lewis food hamper in the region of about £500. That was offered to a member of staff in development services, and you can see from the register that was very, very politely declined and returned.
that's great. Yeah, that clarifies that point. And as you say, there's very few for development services, which is reassuring in that regard. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or points? Okay. Can I have a formal proposer to note the report?
Happy to propose that, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Payne. Can I have a seconder, please? Yeah, Townsley, thank you very much for that, Councillor Townsley Hinton. So proposed and seconded. Those in favour of noting the report as per the recommendations? Yeah, I think that's everybody. Noted. So moving on then, members, we have an update on the Code of Conduct complaints register, starting on page 49 again, as per tradition almost, and Helen will be introducing this item for us again. So that regularly comes before us, and before we do get Helen to introduce, are there likely to be any questions where we need to go into a special session? I may have one, but on one of them, but I will allude to that at that point. So yeah, Helen, if you would like to introduce that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair. So just to mention that Rosalie Hawks has just joined us. Hello, Rosalie.
Oh,
good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, and apologies for double booking myself and running late.
So in terms of this particular report, again, members will be familiar with regular updates to Standards Committee in terms of Code of Conduct complaints that I've received. So I last reported to you back in March, and since then I've received 5 new Code of Conduct complaints. At the last meeting, no complaints were outstanding, so there were just those 5 that I needed to deal with. The 5 complaints, one of them at the time that I wrote the report had been concluded, and that is the complaint that forms the summary, the exempt appendix 2. And obviously, if members do want to ask any specific questions about that, then I will be able to read out the formal resolution for you to pass to enable us to do that. At the time of writing the report, the other complaints were outstanding. I will formally report this into the next meeting, but since writing the report and the meeting today, 3 of those complaints have actually been withdrawn by the complainant. So an initial complaint came in to me. I wrote to the complainants to ask for some additional information. I haven't received that additional information, and I've contacted the complainants who've said that they wish to withdraw the complaints at this moment in time. So at the moment, there is only one complaint outstanding. In terms of complaints dealt with generally, again, you'll be familiar with Appendix 1, which is a list of all the complaints that I've dealt with since the inception of the standards regime. So I'll leave it there, Chair, but obviously if members do have any questions on the exempt appendix that would lead to the identity of the member complained about or the individual that has made a complaint, then my advice would be that we ought to go into a private session in order to be able to discuss that quite openly.
Fine, thank you, Helen. Any general questions first? Yeah, Mike Hope.
Yeah, just briefly. These go all the way back to 2013. I've seen a lot of them before. Surely all we need to look at are new complaints. Why do we have this running record? I mean, in 20 years' time, is it going to run to 30 pages? At what point do we say, no, we're not going right back to the start. We're just going to deal with complaints that haven't come to this committee before, which makes absolute sense to me. Because really, when I first looked, I thought, why has been a lot? And then I thought, no, if you look at the dates, most of them are irrelevant. I maybe go back a year, but not what we're looking at going back 6-7 years. It seems a bit silly.
Helen, do you want to respond to?
Thank you, Chair, if I may. So, Councillor Hope, the reason that it's a running record is that's what Standards Committee asked me to do, obviously several years ago. If actually, the current composition of Standards Committee, agrees that actually we don't need to see that data running back all of that time. And obviously, if there becomes a time when you would like to have that full record, then certainly for my records, I would continue to just add to my list. So I could absolutely share that with Standards Committee in the future if the need arose. But if Standards Committee felt that actually we only need to see maybe last year plus the current year, and then I drop the previous year off as we go into the next financial year, I'm absolutely more than happy to do that. So I've taken instruction from the committee.
If I could come, yeah, I fully agree with that, and I think there probably is some sense in having probably up to date this year and the previous year, simply so that you can actually compare numbers in a way and sort of say, oh, things are getting better, or in the case of Calton, they're getting worse. I don't know, but the important thing is, I think that we really don't need to go back 7 years. That's way over the top.
I mean, I would probably concur with that, with the proviso, Helen, and the rest of the committee, that if there are unresolved complaints that go back longer than that, and obviously they should appear upon the report. I mean, I think with that proviso, then I'm happy to have a reduced list for most of those, I would say. So if that's acceptable to everyone, if we can just have a show of hands, that's what we'll do. Thank you.
Chair, I'm quite happy to pick that up and maybe bring a version to the next meeting. While you were talking, Councillor Hope, what was going through my mind is maybe so that you are able to compare, just maybe include high-level figures. So in 2013, this is the amount that we received. 2014, 15, this is the amount. Blah 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 blah. Yeah. So you don't have the detail, but actually you can absolutely see the workload and the number of complaints. So I'll have a think about the easiest way to present that data to you. Obviously, at the next meeting, if you'd like me to change that, if it doesn't quite work for the committee, I'll be more than happy to again take views and come up with something for the next meeting. But absolutely more than happy to give you the data that you feel is useful to you. So I'll make sure that's done for the next committee meeting.
John, you've got your pen.
Sorry, if I could just be a little mischievous once again, that I think Helen and I did persuade another authority to adopt the way that it's being done at the moment. And while saying that I would not like us to appear to be less thorough than that other authority, if we do add something like a bar chart or something like that that records the history, as it were, in broad outline, I think that would safeguard our blushes as not being as transparent as another local authority. And certainly to keep live cases, however long they are, because we have had cases that have gone a very long time, I forget how long, but certainly 2 years, they must be kept on the table, I think. Partly because the councillors need to be aware that certain cases are dragging on and make their own comments.
Fine. That makes perfect sense to me, and obviously Helen will come back with her view as the best way of actually achieving that. I do have one or two specific questions on one of the things which I think we need to go into special session for, but what I'm going to do is attempt to be helpful and say, do we have any items of any other business that we could take first so that we could allow that to happen, and then take that at the end, maybe a better way of proceeding. And I've received none either, so I think at this stage we need to read out our resolution and then and so on. Helen, you are muted.
I was just saying, is my mic on while I looked for the resolution?
But it wasn't.
So Chair, if I can ask that a member formally moves that, being satisfied that the public interest in maintaining the exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information, that under section 100A4 of the Local Government Act 1972, the public and press be excluded from the meeting during the consideration of the ensuing report on the grounds that the confidential appendix would involve the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraphs 1 and 2 of Part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972. If I can have somebody to move, formally second, and then vote on that, please, Chair.
Thank you. Do we have a mover for that? We have a Councillor Townsley Hinton has moved. Do we have a seconder? And we have Councillor Mike Hope seconding that. Thank you. All those in favour, please show. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So I think that's carried. So can I ask Caroline and Claire to end the recording and live streaming of this meeting, please?